In the jungles of man charging him collapsed mid-step. Another came forward, shouting, 2 more shots. Silence. That moment spread through the ranks like wildfire. Marines began to whisper that the Colt wasn't a relic. It was survival. The Japanese, who had believed their own pistols were symbols of superiority, now faced an enemy whose sidearm could end a charge before it began. Every night after, the sound of that pistol became a warning. It wasn't just a weapon anymore, it was a promise that the line would hold. The jungle didn't respect tradition, and neither did the Colt 45. It respected only one thing: what could survive the night. The fear of the Colt 45 didn't start with superstition. It started with physics. On paper, the American pistol fired a .45 caliber round at only moderate speed, but its heavy bullet hit with terrifying force. At close range, the effect was immediate and absolute. It didn't matter if a man was charging, screaming, or high on adrenaline. The moment that slug connected, it stopped him cold. The Colt wasn't elegant, but it was honest. In a world where weapons jammed, misfired, and failed under rain and mud, the Colt 45 always seemed to work. And that reliability became something even deadlier than raw power. It became psychological. The Japanese Type 14 Nambu, by contrast, looked like a masterpiece of engineering. Its long barrel and light frame made it comfortable to carry. Officers loved its balance and sleek profile. But in the jungles of the South Pacific, looks meant nothing. The Nambu fired an 8mm round that lacked the stopping power needed to put down a determined Marine. Reports from the front revealed a chilling pattern. Japanese soldiers would empty half a magazine into an American and watch in disbelief as he kept coming. Even when they scored hits, their opponents often didn't fall immediately. The Colt's round, on the other hand, was merciless. It tore through heavy cloth, bone, and muscle, with a weight that made the Nambu's shots feel like pebbles. Marines noticed the difference right away. In close combat, the first man to land a shot often won, and the Colt made sure that man was them. The pistol's recoil was harsh, but its simplicity made it perfect for the Pacific's chaos. It had no fragile parts, no hidden springs that clogged or corroded. You could drag it through the muck, rinse it in a puddle, and it would still fire. The Nambu's safety, placed awkwardly on the back of the frame, required both hands to operate, a design flaw that became deadly when seconds mattered. Its thinner springs often snapped, and its firing pin sometimes broke entirely. Japanese officers began quietly scavenging Colts from fallen Marines, a grim acknowledgement that their own sidearms couldn't compete. The real difference, though, wasn't in metal. It was in emotion. When Marines carried the Colt, they carried certainty. When Japanese soldiers heard its report in the dark, they heard finality. It was a sound that meant the fight had shifted from the realm of courage to inevitability. The Colt had turned from a sidearm into a symbol, a weapon that didn't just wound, but erased. On islands where every encounter could be your last, the Japanese began to understand that facing the Colt 45 meant facing an opponent who could end the charge before it ever truly began. By the end of Guadalcanal, they no longer mocked its weight or its bulk. They feared the silence that followed its single, thunderous shot. Word of the Colt 45's power spread across Guadalcanal, not through official reports, but through whispers in the mud. The Marines who survived those night raids couldn't stop talking about it. Around flickering fires and in half-collapsed foxholes, they passed the stories along. How a single shot from that pistol dropped a charging soldier dead in his tracks. How it saved an entire squad when every other gun had jammed. The Colt had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol of survival, a companion that never failed when everything else did. Soldiers joked about its weight during the day, but at night, when the jungle went quiet, that heavy steel felt like security itself. The stories traveled fast. A few hundred yards down the line, men who hadn't even seen the fight swore they heard the pistol's distinctive bark and the sudden silence that followed. The tale grew with every retelling. Some said it could punch through armor. Others said it could throw a man backward off his feet. In the damp, nerve-wracked trenches of Guadalcanal, these stories became morale. The Colt wasn't glamorous, but it was reliable. And reliability, in a place where everything rotted or rusted, was worth its weight in gold. Meanwhile, those same stories reached the Japanese through captured prisoners and terrified survivors. The enemy began to associate that deep, echoing gunshot with death. One Japanese sergeant, in a diary later found by Marines, described the pistol as a beast that kills with one roar. His men, he wrote, called it the short rifle of the devil. The name stuck. As weeks turned to months, Japanese raiding parties began approaching Marine positions more cautiously, throwing grenades from farther away, delaying their charges. The Colt had become more than a weapon. It was a psychological barrier. The strange thing was, the fear existed on both sides. For the Marines, the Colt was a lifeline, but it was also a reminder of just how close the fighting had become. If you were down to your pistol, it meant the enemy was nearly on top of you. The gun's legend was built on desperation, on moments when survival was measured in inches. And yet, that was exactly why men trusted it. The Colt didn't promise glory or victory. It promised one more breath, one more heartbeat, one more sunrise. It was the last word in every argument the jungle tried to make, and everyone, friend and foe alike, knew what it meant when that word was spoken. To understand why the Japanese came to fear the Colt 45, you have to step into their boots, their mindset, their culture, and their pride. Before the Pacific War erupted, the Japanese military trained its men to believe that courage was stronger than any bullet. Their code, rooted in Bushido, taught that victory came from spirit, not steel. A warrior who charged without hesitation was considered unstoppable. Weapons were extensions of that spirit, not tools to rely on. The Type 14 Nambu pistol embodied that philosophy. Elegant, precise, and light. It wasn't designed for chaos, it was designed for control. Officers carried it as a badge of honor, not as a lifeline. But Guadalcanal didn't honor tradition. The jungle didn't care about rank or ceremony. It respected only what worked. The first Japanese troops who faced the Colt 45 learned that lesson the hard way. Their Nambu pistols, so admired on the parade grounds of Tokyo, faltered under the suffocating humidity and filth of the island. The springs weakened, the safeties jammed, and their underpowered 8mm rounds barely slowed an enemy charging through adrenaline and fury. When the Colt barked, the effect was instant and horrifying. Men dropped where they stood, their bodies thrown backward by the force of impact. The survivors of those encounters began whispering to one another. They said the Americans had a weapon that could kill with one hit, a pistol that roared like thunder and never failed. Captured Japanese diaries and later testimonies revealed an unnerving pattern. One officer wrote, "We struck their line and saw flashes, short, low bursts. Our men fell. It was not a machine gun. It was something else." Another account from a surviving corporal described the panic during a night raid. "A sound like a cannon. One of our brave men fell with no cry. The others hesitated. That hesitation was the first crack in the myth of Japanese invincibility." The Colt didn't just wound, it humiliated their confidence. It proved that technology and discipline could overcome spirit. And for soldiers raised to believe otherwise, that realization was devastating. As the campaign dragged on, more Japanese troops began scavenging Colt 45s from fallen Americans. Officers who once saw the weapon as foreign and bulky now treated it as a prized trophy. To wield one was to carry proof that you had survived an encounter few others did. The irony wasn't lost on the Marines who found those same pistols on captured or fallen enemies. It was the ultimate admission of respect. Even the Imperial soldiers, bound by pride, couldn't deny the Colt's superiority when their lives depended on it. But the real terror didn't come from the pistol itself. It came from what it represented. Every time a Japanese patrol prepared to breach American lines, they did so with the memory of that sound lodged in their minds. The Colt became the punctuation mark of every failed assault. They feared the dark because it hid the Marine crouched behind sandbags, waiting to draw that weapon the second his rifle failed. It wasn't just a sidearm anymore. It was a symbol of inevitability. By the end of 1942, fear of the Colt had spread through Japanese ranks almost as fast as disease. The once celebrated Nambu had become a source of quiet shame. It was said that officers began instructing men to rely on grenades or bayonets rather than trust their sidearms. That kind of fear doesn't happen overnight. It grows from countless close-range encounters, from seeing comrades collapse mid-charge, and from realizing that bravery alone can't defeat physics. In those moments, the Colt 45 didn't just fire bullets, it shattered beliefs. It rewrote the rules of close combat, and in doing so, it earned something no American general could have ever ordered: the respect and the dread of the enemy. By the time October 1942 arrived, Guadalcanal had turned into a nightmare. that neither side could fully control. The Japanese launched relentless night raids on the American perimeter around Henderson Field, waves of screaming infantry charging through rain and barbed wire, trying to overwhelm the Marines by sheer force of will. Their commanders believed that momentum and terror could break the line. But night after night, those charges ended the same way, in chaos, in gunfire, and in the echo of that unmistakable sound. The deep bark of the Colt 45. For the Japanese, that sound became a signal of doom. The moment it cracked through the jungle noise, their momentum faltered. They had been trained to charge through rifle fire, to face machine guns head-on, but nothing prepared them for the sudden finality of the Colt. Unlike rifles that barked in bursts, or machine guns that chattered in rhythm, the Colt's shot was singular, deliberate, and devastating. One moment a soldier was shouting his battle cry, the next he was gone. To the men behind him, that silence meant something had gone horribly wrong. It wasn't just death, it was erasure. Inside the Marine trenches, those same shots meant survival. The men around Henderson Field had come to understand the pattern of these attacks. They knew when the screaming began, when the wire started to shake, and when the first grenades arced through the darkness. They also knew that their rifles, wet and clogged, would only get off a few shots before jamming. When that happened, there was no time to panic. That's when the Colts came out. The Marines fired point blank, their muzzles inches from the faces of oncoming soldiers. The heavy .45 rounds tore through the humid air and into bodies that had been convinced spirit alone could carry them forward. Each night, raid was almost identical in structure, but the outcome was always the same. The Colt 45 became the last line of defense, the weapon that decided whether the line held or collapsed. Its mere presence gave Marines confidence. They knew that even if everything else failed, they still had something that would work. On the other side, the Japanese began to dread those small moments of quiet before the counterfire. Survivors reported hearing the short, booming rhythm of pistols being fired in unison and realizing too late that their charge had failed again. Fear grew not because the Colt was mysterious, but because it was predictable. It showed up every time the Japanese tried to breach the wire. Every time their courage reached its peak, the pistol's report cut it down. The more it happened, the faster that fear spread through the ranks. Some units began hesitating at the wire, throwing grenades wildly before advancing, unsure if their weapons or their courage would be enough. In the humid blackness of Guadalcanal, the Colt 45 didn't just defend Henderson Field, it haunted it. It turned the jungle itself into a trap, one where sound alone could shatter resolve. By the end of those endless nights, the Japanese began to associate that heavy, echoing pistol shot with failure. It was no longer just a weapon, it was a message. It told them the Americans would not break, that the line would always hold, and that no matter how far they ran into the dark, the Colt 45 was waiting. As the battle for Guadalcanal dragged into its later months, the fighting began to shift underground, into caves, ravines, and bunkers where the sun rarely reached. These places weren't battlefields in the traditional sense. They were mazes of shadow, mud, and fear, where a man could be face to face with the enemy before realizing he wasn't alone. Rifles were too long to maneuver in those tight spaces, and submachine guns often jammed when splashed with muck. Down there, the war became personal, primitive, and brutally close. It was in these dark corners that the Colt 45 became more than just a pistol. It became an equalizer. When Marines crawled through caves or cleared Japanese dugouts, they often had seconds to react. The Colt's heavy frame, once mocked for its bulk, was suddenly perfect for those confined conditions. It could be drawn fast, aimed instinctively, and fired one-handed if needed. Its short barrel made it ideal for tight corners, where visibility was barely a few feet. Japanese soldiers who ambushed from behind rock walls or roots quickly learned what that meant. The roar of the Colt at arm's length, followed by silence. In a place where hesitation meant death, the pistol's reliability was unmatched. The Japanese, on the other hand, found themselves at a deadly disadvantage. The Nambu's lighter spring mechanisms jammed easily when exposed to dust or moisture, and its weak round often failed to stop a Marine at such close range. More than one Japanese soldier emptied his pistol into an American, only to be cut down by a single return shot from the Colt. Those moments spread through the Japanese ranks like ghost stories, accounts of men who fought bravely but fell instantly, while their opponents seemed unstoppable. The myth of the invincible spirit began to erode under the reality of physics. In the tunnels of Guadalcanal, fear wasn't an emotion, it was an environment. Every echo, every drip of water, every metallic click could send adrenaline surging. And when that sound belonged to the Colt 45, it carried a specific weight. The Japanese began to recognize it instantly, a low, booming report that rolled through the narrow spaces like thunder in a cave. Survivors described how it felt to hear that sound closing in, each shot bringing the realization that escape was impossible. The Marines didn't think in terms of fear or respect. They thought in terms of survival. They moved methodically, clearing room by room, the Colt leading the way. Its big .45 slugs smashed through wooden barriers and ricocheted off rock, leaving no question as to its effectiveness. In those moments, it wasn't about technology or training. It was about who had the weapon that would fire when it mattered most. The Colt didn't just fire bullets. It gave the man holding it the edge, the confidence to keep moving forward through the darkness. For the Japanese, the Colt became the sound of inevitability. It was the punctuation at the end of every failed ambush, every desperate last stand. They began to fear the caves themselves, knowing that inside waited Marines, armed not with luck or fancy machinery, but with the one weapon that never failed them. Down there, courage meant little, and spirit meant nothing. The Colt 45 ruled the dark, and everyone who faced it learned that in the tunnels of Guadalcanal, there was nowhere left to run. By the end of 1942, the Colt 45 was no longer just a sidearm. It was a symbol. Stories of its power spread faster than any official report. Marines told wild tales in muddy foxholes, how it could knock a man backward, blow through jungle trees, or fire even after being buried in mud. None of it mattered if the stories were true. What mattered was that everyone believed them. The Colt had become a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. For the Japanese, that belief turned into dread. Survivors began describing it as the thunder gun, a weapon that could not be escaped. Some even claimed the Americans carried it as a kind of lucky charm, proof that they could not be stopped. Fear of that single heavy gunshot became part of the jungle itself. The myth of the Colt began shaping tactics. Japanese raiders, once fearless, started hesitating before charges, throwing grenades too early or retreating when they heard its booming report. A second of hesitation was all a Marine needed to survive. Commanders noticed it too, the morale of their troops rising with every story, the enemy's resolve breaking a little more each night. The Colt 45 wasn't just a firearm anymore, it was a presence. Marines carried it like a promise. They knew if the rifle jammed, the pistol would still roar. And that roar had power beyond the battlefield. It rewired the fight itself. As the war moved to new islands, the pattern repeated. The Colt led men through caves, trenches, and ambushes, always proving that simplicity and reliability could overcome numbers and noise. Japanese soldiers began to adapt, avoiding tight spaces, flooding tunnels before entering them, anything to escape the weapon that haunted their memories. The myth had changed behavior on both sides. Fear made men cautious, belief made them brave. By the time Guadalcanal fell, both armies understood that not all power comes from size or strategy. Sometimes it comes from the weapon that never fails, and the men who believe in it.